The Texas sun had long set, but the events of that night still echoed in Rick Dawson's mind. A little girl, moments away from being lost forever, now safe in her parents' arms. A trafficker, confident he could slip away unnoticed, now in handcuffs. And Rick, just a retired veteran, an ordinary man who had refused to ignore his instincts, had made all the difference. If you missed part 1, here's what happened. While shopping at Walmart, Rick noticed something off. A little girl who didn't quite match the man she was with, a strange tension in the air, a gut feeling that wouldn't let go. When the police dismissed his concerns, he took matters into his own hands, following the man's car all the way to the border. There, he uncovered the horrifying truth. The girl had been drugged, moments away from disappearing into the unknown. Now, as the dust settles, new questions arise. Who was Miguel, really? How many others had he taken before Chloe? And what will Rick do with this new sense of purpose burning inside him? One thing is certain, his fight isn't over yet. Welcome to part 2 of Rick Dawson's story.
Rick Dawson never expected that a simple grocery run would lead him into the heart of a terrifying crime. He was a man of habit, a veteran in his late 60s who had seen his fair share of danger in the world, yet nothing could have prepared him for what he encountered that day at Walmart. It started like any other morning. He and his wife, Margaret, had planned a quick stop at the store to pick up some medication and a few household essentials. But fate had something else in store. As they left the store, Rick's sharp instincts, honed from years of military service, picked up on something unusual, a little girl waving at him, her bright eyes filled with an innocence that tugged at his heart. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a child's friendly gesture, but as Rick observed the scene, an unsettling feeling crept over him. Something was off. Moments later, he saw the girl being pulled away by a man who didn't look like he belonged with her. The way he held her wrist, too firm, too forceful, sent alarm bells ringing in Rick's mind. When the girl hesitated, her body language stiff and hesitant, it confirmed his worst fears. Rick followed them, discreet but deliberate. Margaret, ever the voice of reason, whispered his name, a quiet plea for him not to get involved. But Rick knew he couldn't just walk away. He had seen too much in life to ignore a gut instinct this strong. As they reached the parking lot, the girl's soft whimper broke through the morning air. That was all Rick needed. "Hey, what's going on here?" His voice was calm but commanding. The man stiffened. He turned, his grip on the girl tightening as he forced a smile. "Oh, it's nothing, sir. Just taking my niece to the car." Rick wasn't convinced. He looked at the child, her wide, terrified eyes, and saw the silent plea for help written all over her face. Before he could act, the man shoved the girl into a vehicle, slamming the door shut and rushing to the driver's seat. Rick didn't think. He moved, launching forward. He reached the car just as the engine roared to life. The vehicle lurched, tires screeching against the pavement. Adrenaline surged through Rick as he grabbed the handle, yanking the door open. He caught the man by the collar, but the kidnapper fought back, his elbow swinging wildly. A sharp pain shot through Rick's ribs, but he refused to let go. Margaret was already on the phone, calling 911, her voice shaking but steady. The parking lot became a blur of movement, people stopping, watching, unsure whether to intervene. Then, the door to the back seat flung open. The little girl scrambled out, her tiny legs moving as fast as they could. "Run, sweetheart," Margaret shouted. The girl didn't hesitate. She bolted, and just in time, because the kidnapper, realizing his plan had failed, slammed the car into reverse, nearly throwing Rick off balance. The tires screeched once more as the vehicle tore out of the lot, disappearing onto the main road. Rick turned, his heart still pounding, searching for the girl. She had stopped near a couple exiting the store, tears streaming down her face. But she was safe. That was all that mattered. Within minutes, the police arrived. Statements were given, descriptions provided. The little girl, whose name they learned was Chloe Parker, was soon reunited with her frantic parents. Evelyn and Roy Parker were overwhelmed with relief, clutching their daughter as if they would never let go again. Rick had been prepared to leave it at that, to let the authorities take over. But when the police caught the kidnapper hours later and searched his car, what they found sent a chill down Rick's spine. Multiple IDs, fake passports, duct tape, Chloroform. This wasn't just a random abduction. It was something planned, something deeper, something far more sinister than Rick or anyone else had realized. And it wasn't over yet. Rick Dorson stepped out of the police interview room, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion. The events of the day had left him drained, the adrenaline that had carried him through the chaos now fading into an unsettling fatigue. What had started as a simple morning errand had spiraled into something far more terrifying than he had anticipated. As he entered the waiting area of the Laredo Police Department, his eyes immediately searched for Margaret. He found her sitting among a small group. The Parkers, their daughter Chloe safely nestled between them, and two women who appeared to be from Chloe's school. Margaret glanced up the moment she saw him, offering a small, reassuring smile. Even with worry etched into her features, she was his steady presence, his anchor. Rick made his way over, each step a reminder of how drastically the day had shifted. He caught snippets of the conversation as he approached. "We need to ensure nothing like this ever happens again," Mr. Parker was saying, his arm wrapped protectively around Chloe's small shoulders. His voice, though calm, carried an unmistakable edge of urgency. The school principal, a tall woman with graying hair pulled into a severe bun, nodded emphatically. "I assure you, Mr. and Mrs. Parker, we take the safety of our students very seriously. I will be proposing several new security measures to the school board immediately." "What kind of measures?" Mrs. Parker asked, her voice still trembling from the ordeal. "We're looking into implementing a mobile alert system," the principal explained. "Parents will receive real-time notifications if a child leaves school premises unexpectedly. We'll also introduce a barcode scanning system for student pickups. It would allow us to track who takes the children from school, ensuring that only authorized individuals can do so." Mrs. Parker exhaled, the tension in her posture easing just slightly. "That sounds like a good start. But how soon could this be put in place?" The principal hesitated before replying, her tone regretful. "It will take time to get the board's approval and to implement the technology. In the meantime, we will immediately increase security presence during drop-offs and pickups." Rick could see the doubt lingering in Mrs. Parker's eyes. He understood that no amount of reassurances would erase the terror she had felt watching her child nearly being taken from her. She would never look at school security the same way again. Before anyone could say more, an officer approached. The room fell into silence, all eyes turning toward him. His posture was firm, but his expression was not unkind. "We've processed all of your statements," he began. "Everything you've provided matches the evidence we've gathered so far." He hesitated, then his voice grew more serious. "However, we discovered something on the suspect's phone that you need to be aware of." Rick felt Margaret stiffen beside him. The officer pulled out a small notepad, flipping it open as if to gather his thoughts. Then, he looked up, his gaze falling on the Parkers. "We found multiple photos of Chloe." Mrs. Parker gasped, her hand flying her mouth. Her husband's grip on their daughter tightened. "Where?" Mr. Parker demanded, his voice sharp with fear. The officer's expression darkened. "At school, at your home, at the park, even at a family gathering. They appear to have been taken over a period of weeks, possibly longer." Mrs. Parker inhaled sharply, her entire body going rigid. "Oh my God," she whispered. The officer continued, his voice gentle but firm. "That's not all. We also found detailed records of your routines, your work schedules, the times you leave and return home, your weekend habits, even Chloe's private music lessons at home." Mr. Parker's face drained of color. He knew everything, he muttered. Rick watched as Evelyn Parker trembled, her arms wrapped protectively around her daughter, as if she could shield her from the mere knowledge of how much danger she had been in. "What does this mean?" Mrs. Parker asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are we safe? Are we still in danger?" The officer lifted a hand in an attempt to calm her. "At this time, we don't believe there's an immediate threat. Based on the evidence, it appears that Ortiz acted alone. We found no records of communication with any accomplices." "Has he confessed to anything?" Mr. Parker asked, his jaw tightening. The officer shook his head. "So far, he has refused to speak. He's exercising his right to remain silent." Mrs. Parker swallowed hard. And what happens to him now? He'll be formally charged, and given the evidence, he'll likely face life in prison. Rick listened carefully, but something nagged at him. His gut told him that Ortiz hadn't been working alone. No one orchestrated a kidnapping this meticulously without help. "Officer," Rick spoke up, "if Ortiz was planning to take Chloe across the border, wouldn't he need forged documents? Especially since he already had multiple IDs himself? Couldn't that suggest there were others involved?" The officer nodded. "That's a valid concern, sir. It's true that he might have had someone provide him with false identification. However, we didn't find any such documents prepared for Chloe. There are no suspicious texts or calls to other individuals on his phone." Rick frowned. It still didn't sit right with him. The officer continued, "Our current theory is that he was planning to hide her in the trunk of his car to cross the border. That's likely why he drugged her." The weight of those words settled over the group like a heavy fog. Margaret reached for Rick's hand, gripping it tightly. He could feel the tremble in her fingers, a silent acknowledgement of just how close they had come to something truly horrifying. Mrs. Parker wiped at the tears forming in her eyes. "And you're sure there are no other threats? No one else watching us?" The officer hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "At this time, we don't believe there are any active threats against your family. But as a precaution, I would strongly advise against returning to your home tonight." The room was silent. Finally, Mr. Parker cleared his throat, his voice hoarse. "My brother owns an apartment here in Laredo. We can stay there for a few nights." The officer nodded approvingly. "That's a good decision." The conversation slowly wound down, but the tension in the air remained thick. No one would forget what had happened today. No one would be able to shake the lingering sense of unease. Rick watched as Mr. Parker placed a steadying hand on his wife's shoulder. He admired the way the man held himself together for the sake of his family, even when fear threatened to break him apart. Then, unexpectedly, Mrs. Parker turned toward Rick and Margaret. "Would you both join us for lunch tomorrow?" she asked, her voice still laced with emotion. "We'd love to properly thank you." Margaret glanced at Rick, as if silently asking if he was up for it. He gave her a small nod. "That sounds like a lovely idea," Margaret said warmly. "We'd be happy to join you." For a moment, the room softened. The fear, the uncertainty, it was all still there, but so was something else. A connection, a bond forged in the face of danger. Little did they know, the danger wasn't over yet. Rick had been quiet for most of the officer's explanation, absorbing every detail. But something didn't sit right with him. He had spent years trusting his instincts, and right now, those instincts were screaming that this wasn't the full story. He shifted his weight, crossing his arms as he fixed the officer with a steady gaze. "Something doesn't add up," he said finally. "You're telling me this guy, Carlos Ortiz, had a stash of fake IDs for himself, but nothing for Chloe? No passport, no documentation, nothing?" The officer hesitated before responding. "That's correct, sir. We found multiple forms of identification for Ortiz, but nothing that suggests he was planning to create a new identity for the girl." Rick's brow furrowed. Then how was he planning on getting her across the border? He had to have had a plan. You don't just snatch a kid without thinking it through. The officer exchanged a glance with one of his colleagues before responding. "Based on what we've found so far, it appears Ortiz was planning to smuggle Chloe across the border by hiding her in the trunk of his car." A cold weight settled in Rick's stomach. The implications of that statement were chilling. Smuggling a child across the border like contraband. It wasn't just dangerous, it was horrifying. Margaret let out a quiet gasp, her fingers tightening around Rick's hand. Mrs. Parker, already pale, seemed to lose what little color remained in her face. "Dear God," she whispered, pulling Chloe closer to her side. Rick's mind raced. This didn't feel like the work of one desperate man acting alone. There had to be more to it. What about accomplices? He pressed. "You checked his phone. Any contacts, messages, calls that seem suspicious?" The officer sighed, clearly anticipating the question. "As of now, there's no direct evidence that he was working with anyone else. No suspicious calls or texts. No records of payments or transactions. It's possible he was working alone." Rick wasn't convinced. A man like Ortiz didn't just pick a child at random and plan a complex kidnapping without some level of organization. It took planning, resources, connections. What if he wasn't supposed to smuggle her out yet? Rick asked, thinking out loud. What if he was waiting for someone else to provide the documents, and the kidnapping happened sooner than planned? The officer nodded, considering the theory. It's a possibility. Unfortunately, without hard evidence, we can't assume he had partners. Rick exhaled, still uneasy. He knew from experience that criminals rarely worked alone, especially in operations like this. But for now, there was nothing more he could do except stay alert. The officer turned back to the Parkers, his voice firm but sympathetic. Regardless of whether Ortiz acted alone or had help, I strongly advise that you don't go back home tonight. If there's even a small chance that someone else was involved, we don't want to take any risks. Mrs. Parker looked at her husband, her expression pleading. Roy, I don't want to go back. Not after everything we just heard. Roy nodded immediately, rubbing his temple as if trying to think through the exhaustion. I was already considering that. My brother owns an apartment here in Laredo. It's in a secure building, and no one knows we'd be staying there. The officer seemed relieved. That's a good choice. We can have a patrol car do a few rounds near the area for added security. Rick had heard of La Contessa before. A high-end complex, secure, and well-maintained. If the Parkers were going to stay anywhere, that was a good place to lay low. Then it's settled, Mrs. Parker said, exhaling as she ran a hand through her hair. We'll stay there until we know it's safe. For the first time that night, Rick saw a flicker of calm return to her face. She reached for his hand, her grip warm and firm. Rick, Margaret, I don't even have the words to express how grateful we are. Margaret smiled softly. We're just glad Chloe is safe. Mrs. Parker hesitated, then said, Would you both join us for lunch tomorrow? It's not nearly enough to thank you for what you did, but we'd love to have you. Rick and Margaret exchanged a glance. Margaret spoke first. That sounds lovely. Rick nodded in agreement. We'd be happy to. A quiet understanding passed between them. They had been strangers just hours ago, thrown together by an act of fate. But now they were something else. Not quite family, not quite friends, but bound by an experience that none of them would ever forget. Rick didn't know it yet, but this wouldn't be the last time he'd step in to protect this family. The danger wasn't over. It had only just begun. By the time Rick and Margaret finally returned home, the weight of the day settled over them like a heavy blanket. The adrenaline that had carried them through the chaos had long since worn off, leaving behind only exhaustion. Neither of them spoke as Rick pulled into their driveway and turned off the engine. For a long moment, they simply sat there, staring at the darkened house. It was strange how the world outside remained unchanged, indifferent to the events that had unfolded that day. The streetlights flickered softly, casting long shadows over the neatly trimmed lawn. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, a car passed by, and the world continued as if nothing had happened. Margaret let out a deep sigh, rubbing her temples. Can you believe we only went out this morning to get groceries? Rick let out a tired chuckle. Seems like a lifetime ago. Margaret shook her head. And after all that, we didn't even get the groceries. That realization made Rick laugh. A quiet, weary sound that barely held any amusement. After everything, after the chase, the police station, the horrifying revelations about Chloe's abductor, it all circled back to something as mundane as forgetting to buy food. Well, he said, reaching over to squeeze her hand, guess we'll survive one night without them. Margaret nodded, too tired to argue. Slowly, they climbed out of the car and made their way inside. The familiarity of home was both a comfort and a stark contrast to the nightmare they had just lived through. The house smelled the same, looked the same, yet everything felt different. Without speaking, they moved through their usual nighttime routine. Margaret took her arthritis medication. Rick locked the doors, double-checked the windows, an old habit of his, but one that felt more necessary than ever tonight. By the time they slipped into bed, neither had the energy to say much. Margaret rolled on her side, her voice barely above a whisper. Do you think they'll be okay? Rick stared at the ceiling for a long moment before answering. I hope so. She reached for his hand under the covers, holding on to it as sleep slowly pulled them under. And for the first time in what felt like forever, they both slept deeply, their bodies too exhausted to do anything else. The morning light crept in through the curtains, golden and warm. When Rick finally opened his eyes, he squinted at the alarm clock beside him, his mind still sluggish from sleep. It took him a second to register the numbers. 10:30. He blinked. Then he turned toward Margaret, shaking her gently. "Honey, wake up. You won't believe what time it is." Margaret stirred, groaning as she stretched. Her eyes fluttered open, then widened in surprise when she saw the clock. "My goodness," she murmured. "We slept like teenagers." Rick chuckled. "I don't even remember the last time we slept this late." Margaret sat up, rubbing her arms. For the first time since yesterday, she felt rested. It was a strange feeling after so much stress and tension. Rick grabbed his phone from the nightstand, scrolling through his messages. "Looks like Roy sent me the address for La Contessa. They're expecting us for lunch." He showed Margaret the message. She nodded. "We'd better get ready. I don't want to be late." They moved through the morning in a quiet rhythm, the events of the previous day still lingering in the back of their minds. Over breakfast, they talked about everything except what had happened, what they had seen, what could have gone differently. It was an unspoken agreement, a way to allow themselves a moment of normalcy before stepping back into the storm. As Margaret finished her coffee, she suddenly straightened. "We can't go empty-handed," she said. Rick raised an eyebrow. "I doubt they're expecting gifts." "That doesn't matter," Margaret insisted. "It's about kindness. They've been through so much. We should bring something." Rick smiled, knowing there was no arguing with her once she had made up her mind. "All right, what do you have in mind?" Margaret tapped a finger against the table, thinking. "Something simple. Maybe a few drinks or snacks." "We could stop at a gas station on the way," Rick suggested. "Pick up a few sodas or something easy." Margaret nodded in approval. "That'll do." And with that, they set out once more, unaware that danger was still lurking, waiting just around the corner. The midday sun hung high over Laredo, casting sharp shadows across the pavement as Rick pulled into a small gas station just off the highway. The heat shimmered off the asphalt, making everything look slightly distorted, as if the air itself was warping under the relentless Texas sun. Margaret adjusted her sunglasses as she looked out the window. The gas station was quiet, the kind of place people only stopped at out of necessity. A few cars were parked near the pumps, their drivers moving with the sluggishness that came from enduring the heat. A teenage cashier leaned against the counter inside, staring at his phone. It was an ordinary scene, but Margaret had learned over the years that trouble never announced itself. It lurked in the background, waiting. "I'll run in and grab something," she said, reaching for the door handle. Rick frowned. "How's your knee?" "It's fine," Margaret assured him. "The medication's working well today. Besides, I'll only be a minute." He didn't look convinced, but he nodded. "All right, just be quick." As Margaret stepped out of the car, the heat immediately pressed against her skin. She pulled her purse closer to her side and made her way toward the convenience store. But before she could reach the door, a sharp, acrid scent hit her, cigarette smoke. Her eyes flickered to the source. A man stood leaning against the wall, just beside the entrance, a cigarette hanging loosely between his fingers. His clothes were worn, faded jeans, and a wrinkled t-shirt that looked like it had seen better days. But it wasn't his clothing that made Margaret's breath hitch. It was the way he carried himself. Something about him felt wrong. His posture was too tense, his movements too calculated. He wasn't just standing there to smoke. He was watching. His gaze flicked toward her briefly, scanning, assessing. Margaret had seen that kind of look before. Predatory. Her pulse quickened as memories of yesterday's events came flooding back. The grip Ortiz had on Chloe's wrist. The way he had tried to dismiss Rick's suspicion. The controlled, deceptive calm of a man who thought he was in charge. The man took another drag of a cigarette, exhaling slowly before his gaze locked onto hers. His lips curled into a smirk, eyes dark and amused. "What are you looking at, lady?" His voice was low, rough, laced with something Margaret couldn't quite place. Margaret stiffened. She hadn't realized she'd been staring. Quickly, she averted her gaze, forcing herself to keep moving. She pushed open the glass door and stepped into the store, the cool blast of air conditioning a stark contrast to the heat outside. Her heart was still hammering as she made her way to the coolers at the back. She tried to shake off the unease. Maybe he was just another man killing time. Maybe she was seeing threats where there were none. But she knew better than to ignore her instincts. She selected a few bottles of soda, the cold glass soothing against her palms. As she walked toward the counter, she risked a glance out the window. The man was still there, still watching. A chill crawled up Margaret's spine, despite the warmth of the store. The cashier barely looked up as she placed the drinks on the counter. "That all for you, ma'am?" Margaret forced a polite smile. "Yes, thank you." She fumbled with her purse, her fingers trembling slightly as she retrieved the money. "Calm down," she told herself. "He's just a man standing outside. Nothing has happened." But her gut told her otherwise. The moment the cashier handed her the bag, she turned toward the door, steeling herself for the walk back to the car. She could do this. Just act normal. The heat slammed into her once more as she stepped outside. The scent of cigarette smoke still lingered. The man hadn't moved. He watched as she walked past, his smirk widening just slightly. Then, in a tone far too casual, he said, "Lovely bag, Granny. Where you going? Got any grandkids?" Margaret's stomach twisted into knots. There was something in his voice, mocking, yes, but also laced with a quiet, simmering menace. She didn't respond, didn't slow her pace. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she forced herself to keep her movements controlled, steady. Running would only confirm to him that he had rattled her. Her grip on the plastic bag tightened as she neared the car. She could feel his gaze on her back, could feel it pressing against her skin like a tangible force. The moment she reached the car, she yanked the door open and slid inside, locking it in one swift motion. Her breath was unsteady, her fingers trembling as she set the bag down on the floorboard. Rick glanced at her, immediately sensing something was off. "What is it?" Margaret shook her head, trying to gather her thoughts. "It's nothing," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Rick's eyes narrowed. "Margaret," she exhaled sharply. "That man by the entrance. She hesitated, trying to find the right words. "He just made me uncomfortable." Rick followed her gaze to the store. The man was still there, finishing his cigarette, his attention now seemingly elsewhere. But Rick knew better. He had spent years reading people, and something about this didn't sit right with him either. He turned back to Margaret, his expression unreadable. "You're sure that's all?" Margaret forced a tight smile. "I think yesterday's events have affected me more than I realized." Rick didn't look convinced. He glanced at the man one last time before shifting the car into reverse. "This area isn't the safest," he said, his voice low. "You were right to be cautious." As they pulled out of the gas station and onto the road, Margaret tried to shake the feeling that had settled deep in her chest. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself she was overreacting. But a nagging voice in the back of her mind whispered otherwise. She didn't know it yet, but that encounter was far from the last she would have with that man. And the next time she saw him, it wouldn't be in the harmless setting of a gas station. Rick had seen that look before. From the driver's seat, he had watched the entire interaction unfold. The moment Margaret stepped out of the car, the man had noticed her. His posture shifted slightly, not enough for the average person to pick up on, but Rick had spent years reading body language, assessing threats before they ever materialized. And this man had all the signs of someone who was watching, evaluating, waiting. At first, Rick chalked it up to an ordinary case of loitering. Plenty of people lingered outside gas stations, killing time, smoking cigarettes, lost in thought. But as Margaret moved past him, Rick saw the way the man's eyes followed her. Not just a casual glance, but something sharper. Intentional, calculating. Then came the moment that made Rick's muscles coil with unease. Their eyes met. The man smirked. Not just any smirk, but the kind that carried a quiet challenge, an unspoken message that Rick couldn't quite put his finger on yet. He didn't look away, didn't seem intimidated by the fact that someone was watching him back. That alone told Rick everything he needed to know. This wasn't just some harmless stranger. Something wasn't right. Rick stayed still, gripping the steering wheel as Margaret disappeared inside the store. He kept his gaze fixed on the man, watching the way he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the way his free hand hovered near his pocket, as if ready for something. A weapon? A phone? Margaret was inside for only a few minutes, but it felt longer. When she came back out, Rick saw the tension in her shoulders, the way she held the plastic bag a little too tightly. And then, the final nail in the coffin, the man spoke to her. Rick couldn't hear the words, but he saw the way she stiffened. That was enough. The moment Margaret got into the car, Rick shifted into reverse. He didn't ask questions. Not yet. Instead, he focused on putting distance between them and that gas station as quickly as possible. Margaret exhaled shakily beside him, setting the bag down by her feet. "What is it?" he asked, keeping his voice calm. She hesitated, which told him everything he needed to know. "It's nothing," she said too quickly. Rick glanced at her, then back at the road. "Margaret," she sighed, rubbing a hand over her face. "That man," she said finally. He just made me uncomfortable." Rick didn't reply immediately. He simply nodded, waiting for her to continue. "He was watching me," she said, "and when I walked past, he made a comment about my bag. Asked if I had any grandkids." Rick's grip on the wheel tightened. It wasn't just the words that unsettled him. It was the way Margaret had said them. The slight tremor in her voice. The way she was gripping her purse now, as if replaying the moment over and over in her head. She wasn't someone who spooked easily. Margaret had spent decades by his side, through deployments, through long nights filled with uncertainty, through moments where the wrong move could mean the difference between life and death. And yet, this one exchange, a few words from a stranger, had rattled her. That told Rick everything he needed to know. But he also knew pressing her wouldn't help. If Margaret wasn't ready to say more, she wouldn't. Instead, he reached over and gave her knee a gentle squeeze. "You were right to be cautious," he said simply. She let out a small breath, nodding. The rest of the drive was quiet, but Rick could feel the tension still sitting heavy in the air between them. Margaret kept glancing at the side mirror, as if expecting to see the man's reflection there. Rick didn't say it out loud, but part of him was doing the same. The farther they drove from the gas station, the more he tried to shake the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe it was nothing. But deep down, Rick had learned long ago that his instincts were rarely wrong. And something told him that this wasn't the last time they would see that man. Rick maneuvered the car through the bustling streets of Laredo, the weight of Margaret's unease still lingering in the air between them. He had tried to shake off the tension from their stop at the gas station, but something about that man, his smirk, the calculated way he watched Margaret, stuck with him. Margaret, too, had barely spoken since they left. She kept her gaze out the window, eyes darting between passing cars and side streets, as if expecting to see something. Someone lurking just out of sight. As they approached La Contessa Apartments, the towering structure came into view, sleek and modern against the clear Texas sky. It was an upscale complex, the kind of place where families like the Parkers could afford to lay low without feeling like they were in hiding. The entrance was lined with manicured hedges, tall palm trees swaying slightly in the breeze, the afternoon sun bouncing off the large glass windows of the lobby. Rick eased the car into the parking lot, his gaze naturally scanning their surroundings. A habit, a reflex. That was when he saw it. A car parked near the entrance. A Martin School sticker on the rear windshield. Something about it caught his attention immediately. It wasn't the sticker itself, it was the driver. Rick narrowed his eyes. The man behind the wheel wasn't a stranger. He had seen him before, at the police station yesterday. One of the school staff members. Margaret followed his gaze, squinting slightly. "Isn't that?" Rick nodded. "Yeah, one of the people who was with the principal." Margaret frowned. "What's he doing here?" They watched as the man stepped out of the car, straightening his glasses before adjusting a bag slung over his shoulder. He looked around, then headed toward the building entrance. It wasn't necessarily strange. If he worked for the school, maybe he was checking in on Chloe, bringing something for her, offering support after what had happened. That would make sense. And yet, Rick's instincts nagged at him. "Let's not jump to conclusions," he murmured, mostly to himself. "But I don't like surprises." They parked and got out of the car, making their way toward the entrance. Inside the lobby, the school staff member had stopped near the reception desk, speaking quietly with a security guard. As they got closer, Margaret suddenly tensed. The man turned slightly, revealing his face. It wasn't just any school staff member. It was Triana, the same woman who had been standing beside the principal at the police station. The one who had listened quietly as the Parkers spoke about their fear, their decision to stay at La Contessa. Rick's stomach tightened. Margaret's fingers found his arm instinctively. "Rick." He kept his face neutral as they approached. Triana looked up, offering a small, polite smile. "Oh, Mr. and Mrs. Dorson. Good to see you again." Rick nodded, his expression unreadable. "Didn't expect to see you here." Triana lifted the bag on her shoulder. "The Parkers asked for some of Chloe's schoolwork. I offered to drop it off." Margaret forced a smile. "That's thoughtful of you." Triana nodded. "I just saw them inside. Chloe is still a little shaken, but she's a strong kid." Something in her voice was off. Maybe it was just Margaret's nerves, but she sounded almost too natural, too rehearsed. Rick said nothing, only watching her. The moment stretched between them, unspoken tension thick in the air. Then, a motion outside caught Margaret's eye. Through the large glass windows of the lobby, she saw it, a motorcycle pulling into the parking lot. Her breath caught in her throat. A man in faded jeans and a wrinkled t-shirt, a cigarette hanging loosely from his fingers. The man from the gas station. He wasn't looking in their direction, at least not obviously. Instead, he pulled into the designated motorbike parking area, casually stepping off as if he had all the time in the world. Margaret's grip tightened on Rick's arm. His jaw clenched slightly. He had already sensed her tension before she said anything. "What is it?" he murmured under his breath. She barely moved her lips. "The man from the gas station." Rick didn't turn right away. Instead, he glanced at the reflection in the glass doors, scanning the scene with careful subtlety. He saw him, the same man. Rick's fingers twitched slightly, a barely restrained urge to reach for a weapon he no longer carried. Coincidence? Maybe. But in his experience, coincidences were rare. Margaret's heart was pounding. Her mind raced with every possibility. Was he following them? Watching them? Was it paranoia? Or was she right to be afraid? She tried to brush it off, tried to tell herself it was nothing. But deep inside, she knew this wasn't over. The afternoon sun cast golden reflections across the shimmering surface of the La Contessa pool. The air was thick with the scent of chlorine, mingling with the faint floral aroma of the well-manicured gardens surrounding the complex. Despite the lingering unease from earlier, Margaret told herself to relax. They were in a gated community, a place where people paid for safety, for quiet. This was supposed to be a moment of peace, a brief escape from the chaos of the last 24 hours. Evelyn Parker sat beside her on the shaded patio, the stress of the past day still visible in the tension around her eyes. She sipped from a glass of iced tea, her fingers absent-mindedly twisting the ring on her left hand. "I still can't believe all of this happened," she murmured, more to herself than to Margaret. "Every time I close my eyes, I see her being dragged away." She glanced toward Chloe, who sat a few feet away with Triana, the school staff member who had come to drop off her homework. Margaret followed her gaze. Chloe was scribbling in a notebook, her blonde head bent in concentration while Triana pointed at something in the textbook beside her. The setting was so normal, so deceptively calm, that Margaret almost believed nothing was wrong. Almost. Rick and Roy had left a little while ago, driving together to pick up groceries and essentials. Margaret had been happy to stay behind. Evelyn needed company, and Chloe needed to see that the world hadn't completely fallen apart. Still, something about Triana's presence didn't sit right with her. The woman had been polite, professional even, but there was a strange energy about her. She had barely reacted to the previous day's events, speaking about them with a level of detachment that Margaret found unnerving. And the way she had shown up unannounced, was that truly just kindness or something else? Margaret took a slow breath. Maybe she was just being paranoid. Maybe she was seeing threats where there were none. A rustling sound made her turn her head slightly. She frowned. The landscaping around the pool was lush, designed to provide privacy, but something had moved in the bushes just beyond the gate. Margaret straightened in her chair, narrowing her eyes toward the greenery. Was it the wind? Before she could think further, a dark figure burst from the shadows. Margaret barely had time to register the black mask, the gloved hands, before a sickening thud filled the air. Evelyn's body jerked forward as something struck the back of her head. Her eyes rolled back before she collapsed, slumping onto the table, her glass of tea crashing to the ground. Margaret gasped, her body locking in shock for half a second. A mistake. The man was already moving. Before she could push away from her chair, strong hands clamped down on her shoulders. The grip was iron-tight, yanking her upward with terrifying strength. Margaret twisted, struggling, but the masked man was too strong. She opened her mouth to scream, but her rough palms slammed over her lips. Her heart pounded. Not again. This wasn't happening again. Through the blur of panic, Margaret caught a glimpse of Chloe. The girl had frozen in place, her eyes wide with terror. Run! Margaret wanted to scream, to tell her to move, to get away. But then she saw something even worse. Triana wasn't reacting. She wasn't shocked. She wasn't afraid. She was calm. And then she moved. Not toward Margaret. Not toward Evelyn. Toward Chloe. In one swift motion, Triana grabbed the little girl by the wrist, yanking her close. Chloe let out a cry, but Triana's grip tightened. Too tight. The betrayal hit Margaret like a punch to the gut. Triana, the name barely escaped her muffled lips before the masked man wrenched her backward. Margaret struggled harder, kicking wildly, but it was no use. She was being dragged away, the rough concrete scraping against her heels as she fought. Chloe's terrified eyes locked onto hers. Mrs. Margaret. Triana clapped a hand over the girl's mouth. Shush, she cooed. Soft. Almost gentle. It's all right, sweetheart. Just stay quiet. Margaret's blood ran cold. This wasn't a random act of violence. This wasn't a coincidence. Triana had planned this. And Margaret knew, with a sickening certainty, that Rick and Roy were walking into a trap. Margaret's breath came in short, panicked gasps as the masked man tightened his grip on her arms. She twisted, her instincts screaming at her to fight, to break free, but his strength was overwhelming. He yanked her backward, dragging her across the patio as Evelyn lay motionless nearby, her body limp against the table. Chloe whimpered, struggling against Triana's grasp, her small hands clawing at the woman's arm. But Triana held firm, her expression eerily composed. Stop fighting, she murmured into Chloe's ear. It'll be easier that way, Margaret thrashed, trying to wrench herself free, but then cold steel pressed against her throat. She froze. The knife was small, a folding blade, but it was sharp enough to send a clear message. The man pressed just hard enough for her to feel the edge bite against her skin. Make a sound, he growled, his voice low and rough. And I'll use this. Margaret's pulse pounded in her ears. She finally got a closer look at him, the way his jaw clenched, the tense set of his shoulders, and then the pale shirt. Her stomach dropped. It was him, the man from the gas station. The realization sent a fresh wave of terror crashing over her. He had been following them, watching, waiting. Margaret's fingers curled into fists. She had known something was wrong when she saw him earlier. She should have told Rick. She should have. Pain exploded at the base of her skull. A sharp, blinding crack. Her vision tilted. The world spun. Darkness. Somewhere in the haze of pain and confusion, voices drifted through the fog. Distant, muffled, but clear enough for her barely conscious mind to latch onto. She was supposed to be gone by now. The voice was sharp, irritated. Male. Plans changed, another voice muttered. The masked man. The one who had hit her. A low curse. We can't go to the border. Police are all over it. Margaret's sluggish thoughts tried to make sense of what she was hearing. Border. Chloe. Were they talking about smuggling her out? Another voice, Triana this time, impatient and clipped. Then we do it differently. We demand ransom. This family has money. Let's use it. Ransom. They weren't planning on disappearing with Chloe. They wanted payment. Margaret struggled to stay conscious, to move, to do something. But her body refused to obey. The voices faded. The darkness swallowed her whole. Rick and Roy had only been gone an hour. The grocery run had been simple enough. Essentials, some toiletries, and enough food to last the Parkers a few days in their temporary apartment. Roy had been distracted the entire time, his mind still reeling from everything that had happened. Rick, on the other hand, remained on edge for a different reason. That damn man at the gas station. He hadn't spoken to Margaret about it again, but something about that encounter gnawed at him. He knew better than to ignore a bad feeling. His instincts, the same ones that had kept him alive in combat, were telling him something wasn't right. And when they pulled into the parking lot at La Contessa, his gut twisted. The moment Rick stepped out of the car, a heavy silence greeted him. It wasn't normal. A place like this, a luxury complex with families and kids, should have had some noise. The distant splash of someone in the pool. The hum of conversation drifting from balconies. Something, but there was nothing. Beside him, Roy frowned. Where is everyone? Rick's grip on the grocery bag tightened. Let's go. They walked quickly toward the apartment, Rick's heart thudding harder with each step. His fingers hovered near his pocket, where a gun should have been. But that was a different life, a different time. As they reached the door, Rick knocked once, then turned the handle. Unlocked. The moment he stepped inside, he knew. The glass door leading to the patio was wide open, sheer curtains fluttering in the breeze. A chair lay overturned, a shattered glass on the ground, dark liquid pooling on the tiles. And on the table, Evelyn's purse, untouched. Roy's breath hitched. Evelyn. He moved deeper inside. Chloe. Rick was already scanning, moving, his eyes sweeping over every detail. His pulse pounded. Something wasn't right. Then he saw the table. A white piece of paper sat there, the edges curling slightly from the breeze. Rick moved toward it, already knowing what it would be before he picked it up. $100,000. No police or the girl and wife die. Roy's voice shook. What the hell is that? Rick's jaw clenched. Ransom. Roy's hands trembled as he snatched the note, his face draining of color. His eyes darted around the room, panic taking hold. This can't be happening. This can't. He cut himself off, running toward the bedrooms, his frantic shouts echoing through the apartment. Evelyn? Chloe? No response. Rick turned toward the patio, scanning for any sign of what had happened. The lounge chairs near the pool were empty. No one was in sight. It was as if the world had swallowed them whole. Then a sound. A faint, muffled noise. Rick turned sharply, his senses honing in. It was coming from one of the rooms. He followed the noise, stepping carefully over the broken glass, and entered the bedroom. The air was thick, still almost suffocating. Something shifted beneath the bed. Rick dropped the grocery bag and moved fast, lifting the frame in one swift motion. Margaret. She was bound, gag in her eyes, asterisk wide with fear, asterisk locked onto his. A rush of relief and fury crashed over him at the same time. He pulled her out, his fingers working quickly to undo the ropes at her wrists. The moment the gag was off, she gasped, her voice hoarse. They have them. Rick steadied her. Where? Margaret was shaking, but she forced the words out. Triana. She was working with them. A man, the one from the gas station. They knocked me out. She swallowed hard. They took Evelyn and Chloe. Rick's jaw tightened. The gas station man. He had been right. Roy stood frozen in the doorway, his expression vacant, the ransom note still clenched in his fist. His entire body was trembling. Rick turned to him. Roy. No response. Roy. His voice snapped through the haze, pulling the man's attention. Roy's breath was coming fast, uneven. They have my wife. My daughter. We're gonna get them back, Rick said firmly. Roy shook his head, his grip tightening on the paper. They said no police. If we call them. Rick exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. He knew how these things worked. Ransom demands were always a gamble. Call the police, and they might kill the hostages just to prove a point. Don't call the police, and they might take the money and still kill them. Margaret, still catching her breath, suddenly looked up. Evelyn's phone. Rick turned to her. What? Her purse. It's still here. Margaret gestured toward the abandoned handbag on the table. Her phone might still be on. Roy's eyes widened. He lunged toward the purse, digging through it with frantic hands. His phone was already out, his fingers flying across the screen. Rick and Margaret hovered beside him as he pulled up an app. Then a beep. Roy inhaled sharply. I have it. A map loaded on his screen. A small blue dot blinking. Moving. Rick's pulse quickened. They're still in the car, Roy whispered. About 40 minutes away, heading toward Oil Ton. Rick didn't hesitate. We move now. Margaret clutched his arm. I'm coming with you. Rick met her eyes, about to protest, but the look she gave him, asterisk steady, unwavering. Asterisk made him stop. She wasn't staying behind. All right, he said. Roy barely looked up from his phone, his entire body rigid with determination. Let's go. They moved fast. Within seconds, they were in the car, speeding out of the complex, tearing down the highway. Margaret clutched the dashboard, Rick's hands firm on the wheel, his knuckles white. Roy's eyes were locked on the screen, watching that small blue dot move farther away. Time was running out, and they were praying they weren't too late. The tires skidded slightly as Rick pulled off the highway, gravel crunching beneath the wheels. The old road leading to the abandoned school was cracked and uneven, the kind of place most people ignored, except those who wanted to disappear. Roy was gripping his phone so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. This is it, he said, voice strained. They stopped here. Rick's eyes flicked to the building ahead, a decaying skeleton of what had once been a school, now a husk of broken windows and graffiti-covered walls. The structure was sun-bleached and crumbling, its roof sagging in places. A perfect place for people who didn't want to be found. Rick's gut churned. Why stop here? Was it just a hiding spot? Or had they reached the end of their plan? The police were still at least 20 minutes out. They didn't have 20 minutes. Roy didn't wait. The moment the car came to a stop, he threw open the door and ran. Roy, wait. Rick swore under his breath, but Roy was already sprinting toward the school's main entrance. Then a scream. It cut through the stillness of the empty schoolyard, high-pitched and terrified. Chloe. Roy didn't hesitate. He disappeared through the doorway. Rick clenched his jaw. He had been in too many situations like this before. Reckless charges rarely ended well. But he couldn't let Roy go in alone. He turned to Margaret. Lock the doors. If I don't come out in 15 minutes, call the police again. Margaret opened her mouth to argue, but something in his expression silenced her. She nodded. Be careful. Rick nodded once, then took off after Roy, his boots crunching against the dirt as he ran. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust and decay. The hallways were eerily quiet, lined with empty classrooms where the doors hung off their hinges. Faded posters of children's artwork clung stubbornly to the walls, long forgotten. But none of that mattered. Rick's ears strained for any sound. A muffled voice, a whimper, a scuffle of movement. Rick crept forward, his body low, every sense on high alert. Ahead, Roy had slowed, pressing himself against the wall outside a classroom door. His chest rose and fell with shallow, erratic breaths. Rick moved beside him, gripping his arm. We go in smart, he murmured. Roy barely nodded. His entire body was taut with barely contained rage. Rick leaned in, listening. Inside the classroom, voices were arguing. You shouldn't have taken them both. Triana's voice. Sharp. Angry. You think I care? A male voice. The gas station man. Miguel. Rick's jaw clenched. Then, a soft, broken sob. Chloe. That was all he needed to hear. Rick counted silently. Then, he moved. With a powerful kick, he slammed open the door. The scene inside froze. Evelyn and Chloe were bound to chairs in the corner, their faces streaked with tears. Triana and Miguel stood in the center of the room. Miguel had a gun, and it was pointed at Chloe. Rick's stomach lurched. He had seconds to react. Triana turned, her face twisting with frustration. You idiots! Roy lunged forward before anyone could stop him. Miguel shifted the gun, aiming it straight at Roy. Back off! Roy didn't listen. Where's my money? He spat. You expect me to hand it over after this? Miguel laughed coldly. You don't get it, do you? He gestured at Chloe with the barrel of the gun. This isn't about money anymore. Rick saw Triana's body tense. She turned to Miguel, her eyes narrowing. "We had a plan." Miguel sneered. "Your plan was weak." Triana's nostrils flared. "We were supposed to wait. But you just couldn't help yourself, could you?" She stepped forward. "You're just like Ortiz. Stupid. Impatient." Miguel's expression darkened. For a split second, Rick saw the shift in his eyes. The trigger in his mind had been pulled. The moment before he snapped, Miguel's grip on the gun tightened. His face twisted with anger. He turned the gun on Triana. A shot rang out. Triana's body jerked backward. For the first time, her expression wasn't cold. It was shocked. She stumbled, pressing a hand to her chest. Blood bloomed across her blouse. Miguel watched her fall, then turned the gun back toward Chloe. Rick moved. At the same moment, the police stormed the building. "Drop the weapon." Gunfire. A shot hit Miguel's shoulder. He roared in pain, stumbling against the desk, his gun skidding across the floor. The fight was over. Roy was already at Evelyn's side, untying her hands, his voice shaking as he whispered reassurances. Rick rushed toward Chloe, pulling the little girl into his arms, shielding her from the chaos. Outside, sirens blared. Officers flooded the room, securing Miguel, checking Triana, but she wasn't moving. Margaret was already at the entrance, her face etched with relief and horror. The nightmare was over, but none of them would ever forget what had happened in that abandoned school. The flashing red and blue lights bathed the school's crumbling walls in an eerie glow. The air was thick with tension, but the battle was over. Officers moved swiftly, securing Miguel in cuffs as he groaned in pain, his shoulder bleeding from the well-placed shot. Chloe sat on the back of an ambulance, wrapped in a shock blanket, her small frame trembling. Evelyn was beside her, arms wrapped protectively around her daughter, whispering soft reassurances as she smoothed Chloe's hair. Roy stood nearby, his fists clenched as he spoke in low, heated tones with one of the officers. Rick and Margaret watched from a distance, standing just outside the police perimeter. "She's going to have nightmares," Margaret murmured, watching Chloe stare blankly ahead, her big blue eyes filled with something far too heavy for a child to carry. "That kind of fear doesn't just go away." Rick exhaled through his nose. "No, it doesn't." The officers worked efficiently, securing the crime scene, marking evidence, and taking statements. It was methodical, procedural, the same thing Rick had seen countless times before. But this wasn't a battlefield in some foreign land. This was a school, a place where children had once played, where a little girl should have felt safe. Margaret shuddered beside him. "Roy's right," she said quietly. "They need to leave Laredo. They'll never feel safe here again." Rick glanced at the Parker family, noting the way Evelyn clung to her daughter as if she would never let go again. "Yeah," he agreed. "They should." Nearby, an officer approached them, his face grim. "We've already started the investigation into Triana's involvement. It looks like she had access to school records, including student schedules and addresses. We're working to determine just how long she was helping Ortiz." Margaret shook her head in disbelief. "A school employee," she murmured. "Someone parents trust with their children." The officer sighed. "Unfortunately, predators can be anywhere. She likely used her position to scout potential targets. We'll be going through all of Ortiz's contacts to see if anyone else was involved." Rick nodded, already knowing that for every person they caught, there were always more lurking in the shadows. But at least this was over. As the officer moved away, Margaret let out a long, slow breath. "Well," she said, rubbing her temples, "I take back what I said last night about adrenaline helping my joints." Rick chuckled, shaking his head. "Knew you'd regret that." Margaret sighed. "I just want to go home." Rick wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "Then let's go." They walked back to their car, the tension in their bodies finally beginning to unravel. As Rick pulled onto the road, Margaret turned in her seat, looking out the window. The abandoned school loomed in the rearview mirror, its broken windows glowing under the streetlights. A dark chapter in their lives finally closed. She turned back toward Rick, reaching for his hand. "I'm just glad we trusted our instincts," she said softly. Rick gave her fingers a gentle squeeze. "Always." And as the lights of the city swallowed them, they left the nightmare behind, knowing they had done what they could and that they had made it out together. Thank you for watching this incredible story unfold. It's a powerful reminder that courage, instincts, and standing up for what's right can make all the difference. If you're on the edge of your seat, don't forget to like this video and share it with others, because stories like these deserve to be heard. And if you love gripping, real-life stories that keep you hooked until the very end, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss out on our next video. What did you think about today's story? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you for being part of our community, and we'll see you in the next one.